friends and colleagues, and students. Can y'all hear me? Yeah. Yes, fantastic. I'm Neil Brenner. I'm the chair of SIGU. We are so happy to have all of you with us for this very important event with some brilliant colleagues up here at the stage. And I just want to introduce the event by saying a few words about SIGU. Most of you already know about what SIGU is, but we're really enthusiastic about it, so I want to say a word or two about it. So we established SIGU this past June after a long process of internal discussion and deliberation. It's the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization, and it's a new platform at this fine university for scholarship, teaching, and public events related to environment and society across time and space. It brings together faculty and students who are concerned to address the societal and spatial dimensions of climate change, biodiversity loss, and other forms of environmental crisis and transformation. We now have over 35 faculty affiliates from mostly the Division of Social Sciences, the Division of Humanities, but also from other units as well. Our undergraduate major is vibrant and growing, and we've just established, again, I think as many of you know, a new doctoral certificate, among many other new initiatives. Our goal is to investigate and respond to the environmental challenges of our time by actively centering contemporary environmental emergencies at all scales, from the local to the planetary, in our research and in our teaching. Our major remit is to prepare our students to understand and ultimately, we hope, to influence the social conditions and political economic processes that have produced current and imminent planetary environmental emergencies. And we're committed to a plurality of approaches to these issues. And on this basis, we seek to support and stimulate fundamental interdisciplinary work on the societal mediations of contemporary socio-environmental transformations. From our point of view, the intensifying planetary environmental crises of our time necessitate a radical rethinking of inherited frameworks of knowledge in this pluridisciplinary field. SIGU seeks to contribute to the development of a community of scholars, teachers, and students who are dedicated to the urgent tasks of deciphering contemporary environmental emergencies, and on this basis, confronting the challenges of forging a more equitable, livable, and hopeful planetary future. So we have some pretty serious ambitions in this project, and we hope that y'all will continue to engage with this collective work. For further details, please check out our website, SIGU, so cegu.uchicago.edu. Some of you are laughing because I'm always reminding everyone to check the website, but we've got a lot of information up there, and we want you to check it out. So against this background, it is an honor, a pleasure, and really just a delight to welcome you to today's event, Capitalism's Natures and the Climate Crisis, Nancy Fraser and Jason W. Moore in Dialogue. Over the last decade, political theorist Nancy Fraser and historical geographer Jason W. Moore have been among the most influential and systematic proponents of the claim that contemporary environmental emergencies are best understood in relation to and as a direct expression of capitalism's underlying crisis tendencies. On this understanding, the accumulation of capital is not simply a social or economic process that engenders damaging ecological effects. Rather, capital is itself a way of organizing nature, and thus environmental disasters such as global warming and biodiversity loss reflect its systematic devaluation, or cheapening, as Jason has put it, of the entire planetary web of life in both human and non-human forms. These operations are obscured, our authors argue, in dominant market-centric and technoscientific discourses, which treat nature simply as an exterior parameter or as an infinitely renewable resource supply for human consumption. In contrast, both Fraser and Moore seek to draw attention to what Nancy Fraser, building on Marx, has called the hidden abodes of human and non-human reproductive work that support the operations of capital and indeed life itself on planet Earth. Moore and Fraser have been developing closely parallel lines of argument and discussing each other's work for quite some time. And I believe that Aaron Jakes was in dialogue with both of our colleagues about, was it 7 years ago on a stage at the New School. So in a certain way, this is a continuation also of a public dialogue. between our friends and colleagues here. And so in this conversation, which Professor Aaron Jakes will be moderating, these eminent scholars will consider what their respective approaches to an account of capitalism's natures might offer to scholarship on the climate crisis, and just as importantly, I think for all of us, to ongoing struggles to create more equitable, democratic, and livable ways of being together, both with humans, other humans, and non-human life forms on planet Earth. So a few final words before I turn it over to Aaron, just about our distinguished speakers. So first of all, I think most of you will know Aaron Jakes. He's assistant professor of modern Middle Eastern history at the college. He recently joined us from the New School. We're so happy to have Aaron with us. Sorry, Nancy, but we're thrilled. And Aaron Jakes' work focuses on the modern Middle East, specializing in the historical geography of global capitalism, comparative studies of colonialism and empire, and environmental history. His writings include the wonderful book, Egypt's Occupation, Colonial Economism, and the Crises of Capitalism, which was published a couple years ago by Stanford. And Aaron Jakes is currently working on a new book project titled Tilted Waters, The World the Suez Made, which is a study of the Isthmus of Suez in the context of various kinds of global economic, political, and spatial transformations. Jason Moore is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he's professor of sociology and also leads the World Ecology Research Collective. He's the author, as many of you will know, of a very fundamental book, Capitalism and the Web of Life, published a few years back by Verso, as well as, again, among many other works, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, co-authored with another comrade, Raj Patel, and a very important synthetic engagement with the debate on the Capitalocene, the Anthropocene, an edited book which is titled Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History, and the Crises of Capitalism. And Jason is arguably one of the most influential theorists working on questions of capitalism and environment today. He's really foundationally shaped work on the history and historical geographies, and as he puts it, the world ecologies of capitalism as an environment-making and environment-transforming process. Last but not least, Nancy Fraser is the Henry and Louise A. Loeb Professor of Philosophy and Politics at the New School for Social Research. She works on social and political theory, feminist theory, and contemporary French and German thought. Among her many books, most recently, as many of you will know from last night's event at the Seminary Co-op, Cannibal Capitalism, just published by Verso, as well as Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, co-authored with Rahel Yegi, and Fortunes of Feminism, From State-Managed Capitalism to Neoliberal Crisis, Scales of Justice, Reimagining Political Space in a Globalizing World, and Unruly Practices, Power, Discourse, and Gender in Contemporary Social Theory. Nancy has taught at, among many other institutions, Northwestern, the Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität in Frankfurt, the University of Paris, and the University of the Balearic Islands in Palma de Mallorca.
Best gig.
Final, sounds lovely place, and I'm sure a very interesting institution. A final, couple final words of thanks before I turn it over to my friend and comrade Aaron Jakes. A warm and sincere thank you to Danielle Smith and Carlo Diaz of SIGU for wonderful support in organizing this and many other events. And we would also like to gratefully acknowledge the support of the Gans Fund, which supports geographical studies at the University of Chicago, for providing us with resources to make this and other events possible. And finally, I would just mention a save the date. We have a wonderful conference, the inaugural SIGU conference, on April 20th and 21st, and announcements about the details of that conference, and a really remarkable group of scholars who will be joining us, including in this very room on those days. So April 20th and 21st, please save the date and sign up for our listserver, and you'll get more details very shortly. So let's give a warm round of welcome to our colleagues, and I'll turn it over to you.
Very good. Thanks, Neil. So looking around the room, I know that a lot of you have been reading Nancy and Jason's work very closely for a long time, and some of you even more intensely recently. And so I think what we'll try to do is the three of us will talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time to have a large collective conversation. And so what I'd like to do is sort of lay some groundwork, especially for folks who have not been reading your work closely in recent weeks, and then start to try to tease out some generative disagreements between the two of you and think with both of you. So for starters, kind of building on Neil's very nice introduction to your shared projects, right? Both of you have made a very strong case that, particularly in this moment, it makes very little sense to think about capitalism narrowly as an economic system. Jason, you do this by describing capitalism as a way of organizing nature. Nancy, you do so by describing it as an institutionalized societal order. And so just to kind of lay some groundwork, I thought I would ask each of you to speak for maybe 5 minutes about sort of what you mean by those framing conceptions of what capitalism is, and then we'll go from there. So Nancy, do you want to start off?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Well, what I mean, the problem with looking at capitalism only as an economic system, right, famously based on free wage labor and profit-oriented enterprise and so on and so forth, is that it doesn't allow us to understand all of the other bad things that capitalism necessarily generates over and above exploitation and bad treatment of free wage workers. And at present, this is especially problematic because I think we are in a general crisis of the entire societal order. And I believe that capitalism is at the root of that. But we won't know exactly how capitalism, if it's only an economy, is generating ecological crisis, social reproductive crisis, political crisis, racial justice crisis, and so on and so forth. So my idea is to look at what the conditions for the possibility are of a capitalist economy, what the conditions elsewhere in the social order are. The economy, you could say, is one system or subsystem or one institution, one arena of social interaction, many possible ways of describing it, but one among others that make up an entire social order. So I want to think of capitalism as something big on a par with feudalism, right? It's not just an economy. It's a way, I said this last night, of organizing the relation between the economy and its quote-unquote non-economic background conditions. And those include social reproduction, they include environmental and ecological conditions, they include the organizations of public power, which is equally a condition for accumulation, and a whole realm of un- or underwaged, expropriated human work that doesn't rise to the level of the official system of labor as economized. So I call all of that capitalism as an institutionalized social order. And to me, what's important is that this is an internally differentiated social order in which that consists in several fundamental structural divisions. The division of family from factory, the division of state from market, the division of quote-unquote society from nature. All of these things are institutionalized in such a way as to create a lot of tensions which sometimes rise to the level of acute contradictions, as I would argue is the case now. So what we need to understand is how the societal order places the economy in relation to all of these things, and in a sense licenses powerful economic actors to behave in all sorts of deeply destructive ways in relation to the non-economic zones of the society. Therefore, I think that capitalism has built into it a plurality of very concerning and destructive contradictions, not just the ones that Marx identified. I think that following O'Connor, I think there's a built-in ecological contradiction in capitalism over and above the contradiction between capital and official wage labor, over and above things like the falling rate of profit and so on. There's also a social reproductive contradiction built into it, and political contradictions built into it. I should say here, what I'm trying to do in thinking this way is bring together what I think of as the two Karls. There's a sort of Polanyian side of this, which has to do with the relation between economy and society, as he famously elaborated. I don't agree with a lot of what Polanyi's up to. I think he may romanticize society a little too much and so on and so forth. But still, he's giving us the idea that there are inter-realm contradictions, above and beyond any contradictions that are internal to the official economic system. There are also contradictions between the official economic system and these other background conditions. So ecological contradiction and so on and so forth. To me, this is a way of enriching traditional Marxism, using my dear old missed friend Moishe Posthone's phrase, enriching that account by showing that there are, all these other problematic dimensions of a capitalist societal order. And a critical theory of capitalism, importantly, needs to understand these other dimensions. And I would also argue that anyone who is concerned about transforming this order needs to understand these things as well.
Fantastic. Jason.
What a treat it is to be here. So let me outline a bit about what world ecology, with the hyphen, world ecology as a knowledge liberation movement tries to do. First of all, it's not a theory of everything. It is a knowledge movement. What is it a movement about? It's a protest against and an alternative to the tight relations between the structures of knowledge, the structures of power, and the structures of everyday life in the capitalist world ecology as it's taken shape over the past 5 centuries. That's important to keep in mind today because the long Malthusian cycle, even before Malthus himself, has been a fundamental challenge to socialist strategy, peasant, worker, national liberation movements across the longue durée, and struggling against the tyranny of man and nature, which is a creature of the civilizing project, from Vittoria and the metaphysical instrumentalism of the Iberian scholastics, all the way through Descartes and Hobbes and Locke to Malthus to eugenics to point 4 developmentalism and sustainable development in the Anthropocene today. This is a fundamental challenge for socialist politics to confront and make sense of, to get beyond the idea that in opposition to Marx and Engels' classic formulation, where the social relations of class society are doubly social natural, that on the one hand they are natural, on the other they are social in an irreducibly entwined way, that labor is itself a socio-ecological force, a specifically harnessed natural force of production that not only transforms environments, but in the act of transforming itself transforms the relations of class society and the metabolism of human social formations. That's important because it gets us beyond the 17th century bourgeois scientific revolution view of a collision of man versus nature. Are humans now overwhelming the great forces of nature, as the Anthropocene asks? That's precisely the wrong question to ask. Why? Because invariably it leads to the geomanagerial and technoscientific prescriptions that are at odds with any socialist project to deepen democratization over all of these fundamentally interconnected domains of life around the conditions of production and reproduction of capital, which are irreducibly socio-ecological, the conditions of care, the conditions of energy, etc., that Raj Patel and I talk about in A History of the World and Seven Chief Things. So in many ways, that's the simplest argument to make, that human relations always form within webs of life. They are never separate. There is not a social moment over here and an ecological moment over there. That is a legacy of something I'll talk about in about 30 seconds, the civilizing project in capitalism. That these are irreducibly and dialectically joined, asymmetrically evolving in an ongoing historical geographical set of tensions. That this environment-making dialectic where, to borrow from Raymond Williams, who is ever a great resource, that environments are not only products of human relations, they are producers of those human relations, some more dialectical than others. Volcanoes erupt, whether we are in feudalism or capitalism or socialism or something entirely different. But how those social formations that are irreducibly socio-ecological internalize and adjust to volcanic eruptions, or as we're seeing horrifically in southern Turkey and northern Syria right now, the earthquakes. We need to fully internalize that logic of there is no such thing as a natural disaster, as environmental justice advocates have been saying now for about 15 years. Or the other part of this that we have to deal with, and we have to have difficult discussions around this, is that nature is not only the most complex word in the language, as Raymond Williams said, it's also the most dangerous. And it's not merely an epistemological question or a philosophical question, although it is those. It is also a practical question of how domination, of forms of geocultural domination and class exploitation fit together over the longue durée of capitalism. And this is captured in the great Claudia von Berlehoff's quip that nature became everything the imperial bourgeoisie did not want to pay for. In other words, the unpaid work, which is never free and never gifted, but the unpaid work of, to quote Maria Mies, women, nature, and colonies. But what's often missed in that expression is that for Maria Mies, the problem was the worldwide class struggle and the dynamics of a fundamentally gendered and racialized set of primitive accumulation, which is premised on bourgeois naturalism and this underlying sense that nature is something out there. And that's a problem, not, as I said, not only epistemologically, but in terms of the emergence and development of capitalism as a system of cheap nature, which depends strategically on a qualitative form of super exploitation. Silvia Federici has made this point very well in outlining the specifically gendered, juridical, and cultural forms of creating a new fetish, woman, which is itself an outcome of bourgeois naturalism, as she points out, that women became, in her words, the savages of Europe. That is, the unpaid workers who were super exploited in a qualitative sense to provide the necessary labor power and the semi-proletarian arrangements necessary for the uneven and combined development of capitalism on both sides of the Atlantic in this era. So in other words, for every proletarian moment of these class relations, there is a femitarian moment, a feminized unpaid work, not biologically reduced, as even Berlehoff sometimes suggested, but is feminized through this civilizing project. This goes on with the Lockean project of improvement and forbidding, when he wrote the Constitution for the Carolinas, forbidding indigenous peoples to enter into contracts with the English, again, living in a state of nature. This emerges not from 1492, but after 1570, with the drawing of the world color line slowly, fitfully, first in Brazil, northeastern Brazil, then in the slave societies of the Caribbean, the Carolinas, and into the American South. So there is a long-run problem of bourgeois naturalism that has to be confronted, not just epistemologically and ideologically, but if we are to return to an older left conception of multiracial working class unity that I think goes well beyond intersectionality, it has to understand that the dominations in play are not an abstracted social reductionist conception of race, gender, sexuality, etc. These are actually rooted in the long-term historical dynamics of bourgeois naturalism that develops and fits and starts and reinvents itself you think of Malthus, think about eugenics, think about the population bomb, neo-Malthusianism. There is a long-run ideological project at work that has to be confronted in the present moment to achieve anything that resembles climate justice. And that's where I would end.
Okay.
Thank you.
So there's, I think, already a lot there that can be teased out in sort of subtle differences between how the two of you are thinking about these problems. But before we get there, one of the things that's striking about how both of you have been writing, particularly recently, is that there seems to be a strong agreement that in Origian terms, we're living through an epochal crisis. And so before asking kind of more specific questions about possible areas of disagreement, I wonder whether each of you would say a little bit about what you think the kind of constituent features of that epochal crisis are, and how we know that we're living through it.
Okay. Well, I think I want to plead at the outset a sort of agnosticism about the epochal character of the crisis. It's always hard to know in medias res whether this turns out to be merely a developmental crisis in which we transition to some different form of capitalism, or whether we are really talking about the end of capitalism and the transition to some form of post-capitalism, whether awful or decent or something in between. Because of planetary heating, we do sort of have this sense of having reached some new kind of external limit, let's say. Jason might not approve that formulation, but I think that's an experienced feeling, whether we want to affirm it in the end or not. And so that's why I think people are quick to want to say this is for sure an epochal crisis. I do think there are external limits at the level of, how much greenhouse gas the planet can sequester and so on and so forth. I do think that, But I can't rule out a priori that some fraction of the capitalist class will find, some way of conceiving and getting the power and implementing something that could at least delay the inevitable, if it's really going to be inevitable. And so there might be some post-neoliberal regime of green capitalism, so to speak, and we should be fighting against that possibility, for sure. One thing that I've argued is that, first of all, for me, the ecological is one strand of a multi-stranded general crisis. General crises are rare. They could, in principle, turn out to be epochal in the sense of a transition out of capitalism. So far, they have transitioned to new forms of capitalism. Let's leave aside really existing communism and so on. In the interregnum, I said last night I'm very Gramscian in the way I think. We're in an interregnum of sorts here. And interestingly, even in this country, climate denialism has really lost out. It's becoming a marginal, sort of kooky fringe. And more and more, people agree that there's something bad going on and that we humans are somehow responsible for it, in part. That's, of course, the opening for Jason's move to contest that we humans bit. Good. Andreas Malm also makes this argument, and I'm completely on your side on this. But it means that we are now facing a plurality of proposals as to how to interpret the climate crisis, how to interpret the ecological strand of the general crisis. And as always in these situations, I'll say something that might surprise you for those of you who know a lot of my previous work. I think there's a moment of truth in the Schmittian idea about us versus them. I think we have to find some way of simplifying this field of confused, competing ideas about what to do into an us versus them. And I think it should be us against every form of green capitalism. So, and then we'll see whether there is a socialist or some kind of good post-capitalist thing, and then it turns out to be an epochal crisis, or whether we get green capitalism, or whether we just get some form of barbarism, which is also a possibility. The last point. In insisting that the ecological dimension is one strand, I want to suggest that ecological movements and environmental struggles, however good, are not able on their own to actually, make a good societal transformation. I think that people for whom environmental crisis is their most pressing existential problem, and who want to organize under that banner and fight that fight, are going to have to be allied with other people. And this is not an objective question as to what has priority, but other people who experience something else as their most pressing problem, whether it's that their children are being shot down in the street by police or whatever. So I see a situation in a general crisis with multiple strands. There are going to be multiple forms of response that are potentially emancipatory. But whether anything good comes out of this has to do with whether they can recognize one another as fellow travelers who all share a need, however differently situated, in transforming the societal order and the forces within it that are driving the destruction of the life conditions of everyone. Leave it at that.
Fantastic. I agree with so much of what Nancy just outlined. I think that's absolutely fundamental. I want to say that the projects for green capitalism aren't capitalist. They are a combination of sort of Great Reset, World Economic Forum, Club of Rome. Yeah, the Club of Rome is still around. And aligned with a permanent war, unipolar American imperial strategy against China's Belt and Road. I think those are both visions for a kind of post-capitalist green tributary order. Will that prevail? That remains to be seen, but we can see that the kinds of politics associated, both Nancy and I use this wonderful phrase from Peter Dauvergne, the environmentalism of the rich, the kinds of politics to which that lends itself, including some strands of degrowth, not all, Green New Deal, many strands of Green New Deal rhetoric lend themselves to a replication of the problem that was widely debated in the early 1970s. That is, the imperialist countries' drive to establish green austerity in order to essentially create a kind of steady state global economy that would be post-capitalist because it would be steady state. Now, the question about epochal crisis, I don't think this is speculative. For 25 years, people have been saying, well, what about this? What about that? Let's remember several things, that whether it's a developmental or ecological epochal crisis, rather, depends on whether or not capital and the imperial forces that establish good business environments can resolve the surplus capital problem. So we've had now 50 years of so-called neoliberalism, which has manifestly failed to resolve the surplus capital problem. Why is that? Well, there are many, many complex reasons, and we can go into all of them, but to boil it down to the simplest possible argument, no more frontiers, sizable enough frontiers of cheap natures, that is cheap food, labor, and unpaid work, energy, and raw materials, sufficient to resolve the surplus capital problem, and induce a new wave of labor productivity growth and agricultural productivity growth. So we have three moments. We have the kind of physical productivity question, the real basis of capital accumulation in many ways, and the surplus capital problem. They're both dependent on frontiers of cheap nature to advance. So any agricultural revolution, any industrial revolution, think about the industrial revolution in England, its motive force is not coal. Its motive force is the second slavery and cotton and dispossession and enclosure in the American South. That's where it all comes from. Forget about fossil capital. Let's talk about plantation capital, cotton capital, super exploited capital. So that sets the stage for the resolution of the overaccumulation crisis of that era. This is what Arrighi sort of gestures towards but can never quite land at. And so this is not an entirely speculative problem. We have real concrete indicators. We have $19 trillion parked into zero or negative rate of return government securities. We have the collateralized debt obligations and all the derivatives that led to the events of 2008 are even bigger. And what's the response of the leading imperialist states, including China, including the US, is to prepare for essentially another round of too big to fail mode. That's why even Bob Brenner is saying, well, we're moving towards political accumulation in the United States and not just there. Labor productivity growth has stagnated, in fact, has decelerated over the past 50 years. Agricultural productivity growth is walloped by climate change. Here's my thing about externality. The climate crisis is not external. The climate crisis is the result of the imperial bourgeois enclosure of the atmospheric commons as a dumping ground for cheap waste that is now, over the past 50 years, has been activating is crucial, activating a new set of contradictions that are, in the case of agriculture, the basis of everything in capitalism, as even Brenner and Wallerstein agree, activating a new set of contradictions within world agriculture to prevent a new agricultural revolution, to actively suppress agricultural productivity. Indeed, 7 years of agricultural productivity, according to Bobea Ortiz and her colleagues in the journal Nature Climate Change from a couple years ago. 7 years already. That's huge because capitalism is not a steady state economy. However, a shift towards a tributary political accumulation model is not so dependent on that agricultural revolution model and can impose by force green austerity on the 80% of the planet.
Okay, so in the interest of time and given where this is leading, I'm going to sort of shift the intended order of my questions because you're both touching on something that was quite striking in reading your work, particularly this week in a moment when I'm also in the middle of reading Capital Volume 1 with my undergraduates. And one of the delights of that experience has been the alacrity with which my students noticed that this is a fundamentally hopeful text in ways that they had not anticipated. And so we spent a while talking about how the first moment in the text in which Marx announces a contradictory movement of capital, he's talking about the contradiction between the productive abundance of material wealth and the tendency of value to fall as that productive abundance increases. And so there is in that reading of Capital a kind of optimism that is conditioned on the possibility of an expansive provisioning for human wants and needs through the material conditions of the planet. And both of you in different ways seem to be suggesting that those possibilities, if not gone, are curtailed in ways that they were not in 1867. And so I'm asking this, both sort of, Jason, you just provided a kind of empirically grounded basis for making a version of that case, but to the extent that you're both concerned with the politics of the moment, the kind of hopefulness that grounds an analysis of capital that sees the contradiction between the possibility for actually meeting human wants and needs everywhere and a system that is crushing people and chewing them up, look rather different than one in which pay as you go, as you call it in the book, Nancy, might actually be a kind of necessary condition of the moment that we're living through. And so I wonder, to the extent that any really powerful political movement actually might need to mobilize not just Schmittian enmity, but some sort of collective optimism about what a better world might look like. where you see conditions for hopefulness on, in a situation where material abundance might not look the way that it did in the late 19th century.
Yeah, several things. Yeah, I didn't mean to give Schmidt the last word.
No.
Certainly. I want to give that to Gramsci, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Look, I mean, maybe I'll defer to later this discussion about whether we're using up all the frontiers and so on. I'm not quite convinced about all of that. But there are lots of people in motion. We don't have to convince people that things are bad and they need to get moving to do something. That's happening everywhere. The problem is it's dispersed, it's fragmented, it doesn't rise to the level of a counter-hegemony, it doesn't have a project. It's, well, a lot of it is, actively regressive and proto-fascist and so on and so forth. So people are in motion. This is part of what it means to say that it's a hegemonic crisis, not only an objective structural crisis. And I think the most important thing is to sort of find, ways in which people can discover one another's, as potential allies. I like your reference, Jason, to the old idea of the multiracial, multi-gender, and multinational working class, and so on. And maybe something like that kind of an imaginary is one way to do this. Yeah. So I mean, as a critical theorist, I said this last night, I see myself as offering a kind of map. Here's how you can connect some dots, and maybe here's a map on which you can locate yourself and see what your relation is to other social forces in motion, who you might be allying with, who you should definitely be staying away from. And let's see, there was one other thought that I had about it. And then in my more activist, interventionist mode, as reflected in Feminism for the 99%, a manifesto, I'm saying, let's really draw this line between feminists for the 1% or liberal corporate feminism on the one side and this potentially much larger, pro-working class feminism, whatever you want to call it. I think the same thing should be done. This is what I was getting at before, within environmental movements. I think we should be, you can call it the environmentalism of the poor and the rich, or the 1% and the 99%, or whatever. But and within racial justice movements, within movements for LGBTQ, et cetera, right, liberation, and as well as within the burgeoning and challenged labor movements, union movements that are developing. So I don't know, am I optimistic? I'm not into the thing of like estimating what the chances are for actually pulling off a socialist revolution worldwide are. But I do think, let me put it this way, just on a personal note, I feel more alive now than I have since the 1960s. This is a moment that engages me in such a deep way, with such a sense of the necessity to intervene, and the fact that a lot of you are here, that Jason and I, when we go to talk about this, it's not, we're not just creating this. This is in the air. People want something. So that is a cause for at least some modest optimism.
All right, fantastic. So I think just building off what Nancy said, I would also add that the existential threat language, the catastrophist language, the state of emergency language. Yes, the climate crisis is an emergency, as Neil pointed out. It is not an emergency in terms of how that political discourse is used. And part of what I've been trying to say is that climate doomism, climate catastrophism, which before that was, and still today is bathed in the imperial logic of the Ehrlich's population bomb, which itself grows out of the American Cold War project after World War II, the Population Council, the CIA, USAID projects in the Long Green Revolution in India and elsewhere, which is, of course, how the Ehrlichs opened their book. That there is a climate doomism, a climate catastrophism, an existential threat language that serves the political right and serves also a kind of centrist liberal technoscientific authoritarianism. And that's a form of neo-Malthusianism that we need to become very attuned to. Its acceptable academic form is the Anthropocene, which is spaceship Earth for neoliberal times. All right, so that's we want to have an ecology of hope at this moment. Is there a historical basis for this? And it relates to this question of abundance. So let's be clear about what we know about major moments of unfavorable climate change, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. And I'm going to tell a story about the crisis of Western Rome and the crisis of feudal Europe and the crisis of the 17th century, just in very, very radically compressed ways. First, moments of significantly unfavorable climate change, which in the Northern Hemisphere usually have to do with some combination of volcanism, shifts in the North Atlantic oscillation, things like that. So you think of balmy weather during the Roman climate optimum. Yeah, that's actually what they call it. And then when that, so you could grow wine in southern England, for instance, and move that wheat olive vineyard complex all the way up to the North Sea for a long time. That was not what was driving Roman expansion, but it was fundamental to it. So here's the thing: climate's not everything, but it's in everything. And so as the climate began to shift towards the Dark Ages cold period, there were profound droughts in Africa, in the Eurasian steppe, which drive the so-called barbarian peoples into what is now Western and Central Europe. By the way, I'm not so down on the barbarians. They put an end to the slave society of Western Rome. No, I'm just having fun. But there's a moment where, to get to Aaron's point, a much reduced division of labor, less social surplus in the sense that it was understood in the Roman mode of production, but peasants take over. They rebuild egalitarian societies. They adjust their fertility regimes. They live healthier. They're taller, fewer children. They rebuild villages that had been destroyed by the latifundia system. 1,000 years later, you have the crisis of feudalism. Again, not climatically determined, but you can't understand it without it. It was a socio-physical conjuncture. And the distinctive thing about the crisis of feudalism is that the back of seigneurial power is broken by peasant and working class insurrection across the long 14th century so badly that the ruling classes could not reestablish feudalism. They tried and failed many times across this arc. Then look at that's in the Little Ice Age, the coldest period of the last 8,000 years. Then look at the long, cold 17th century, 1550 to 1700. This is a moment where we get modern racism, modern sexism, a lot of modern science, a lot of core developments. But it is the coldest period of the last 8,000 years. This is the period where we get the plantation revolution. But note this is the Dutch Golden Age. But it ends with a catastrophic war and social revolt, the 30 Years' War. But then also Cromwell sits victorious in London with a communist, as Rediker and Linebaugh say, a communist army, essentially, on the outskirts of London. Like, what the heck are we going to do there? And so there are these moments of political possibility. This is the same story after the Lockheed-Fisher explosion in 1783, changes in the North Atlantic Oscillation that end up with that last great cold snap of the Little Ice Age, which is also the era of the Napoleonic Wars, of the Irish Revolt, of Shays' Rebellion, of proto-socialist moral economy, food riots in England. This is a moment of profound ferment. So these moments of climate crisis are moments of political opportunity. They are moments of hardship for the vast majority, but they undermine the fundamental rules of reproduction and conditions of reproduction for ruling classes. That's a moment of an ecology of hope for the 21st century.
Okay, that seems like a great place to open it up to all of you, and we're nearing the 1 o'clock point, and I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions, so why don't we turn it over to the audience.
This is just for the recording. So I'm going to bring the mic around, but you've got to speak into it so that we have it for the recording, just so everyone knows. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have to leave early, so I'm really happy I got to ask my question. It builds perfectly off, Jason, what you were just talking about. I'm interested in how hopeful it is when you are trying to sell this ecology of hope, given that it is also a story of warfare, huge declines in population, and how we get people on board with that. And also, it's been wonderful seeing long-termism kind of flounder and look ridiculous in news stories lately. But what about those people that do see kind of like the way out as these additional further frontiers on Mars or whatever? And what if people are funneling billions of dollars into that dream as well?
Should we take more than one question at a time?
What are we doing? Yeah.
Sure, why don't we take a couple? We can do them in pairs.
More voices,
yeah.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. So one question I have is, in the current landscape, it really, and I'm a public policy major, concentration in econ, so my bread and butter is a little different, but in the regulatory landscape now, like just with the sheer amount of money being put into things like lobbying, antitrust legislation, things like that, it really seems like the people who are making these decisions are not even so much, say, like the political leaders, as you've given this example of like the peasants revolting against these political leaders. In the current day and age, it almost makes more sense to me that if a revolt like that were going to happen, then people would storm Wall Street rather than the White House, because like that's just where the economic power is concentrated. So I'm just wondering, in terms of this 21st century, almost like takeover of the political sphere by capitalism, how do you anticipate the logistics of this sort of revolution taking place?
Why don't you start? Yeah.
Well, this speaks directly to your quite
will.
incisive analysis of the crisis of democracy in the era of planetary crisis. I mean, the life under class society is always fairly desperate, and under capitalism even more so. So one of the specters of the environmentalism of the rich is a kind of Hobbesian nightmare that, well, okay, things are bad now, but look, they're going to be even worse. I don't think that's true. I think we have to cease to be terrified of the breakdown of the system. I think that we have to embrace the contradictions. Now, that's not being Pollyannish. I'm not saying after Hitler comes us. I'm saying let's be very sober about the kinds of contradictions that are unfolding. And the other question, wait, there's a second part to your question.
Just how do we get people on board?
Well,
How do we what?
Just how do we get people on board with embracing the contradictions?
Solidarity, which is exactly opposite to mainstream environmentalism and even many species of race reductionist environmental justice politics, which fail to name the system and foreground the fundamental, as Nancy was saying, multi-gendered, multiracial, international working class in a broad sense. I speak of the planetary proletariat, which is always a semi-proletariat, which revolves on the unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature. So we have to embrace with Marx and Thomas Munzer, the creatures too must go free. And then the other question speaks directly to the transition to what now I and Brenner and many others call a mode of political accumulation, a drive towards the fusion of high capitalist, imperial, and political power. That there's going to be no great wave of devalorization. And the ruling classes are not going to let capital take its losses. They're going to they're too big to fail.
If they can get away with it.
Well, yeah.
Let me pick up on the second question. Look, I think that you're quite right that in many places, the U.S., the poster child, big money controls the politics. I mean, we've seen this over and over and over again. I could go on and on with some of my least favorite examples. But the result is that government doesn't work. It doesn't deliver. It doesn't address the problems. It doesn't solve them. And things like gridlock, in the Congress or polarization are just the sort of symptomatic expressions of this deeper capture, hollowing out, instrumentalization of public power. And people know that government doesn't work, that it's not. And that's partly what's behind the Make America Great Again, the love of strong men. This guy is going to go in there and make it work. Now, in a perverse way, that's a great critique of neoliberalism. That is a vindication of the need for public power, albeit in this, distorted, deformed mode. That, in a perverse way, is something to build on, because I think that what is needed at a very large scale, as well as at smaller scales, is much more public coordination and planning, all of those things that were supposedly thrown out as red tape and blah, blah. We need a lot more of that. That is central to any socialist project to make our lives livable. We may not know exactly how to organize it. That's a big problem. But that somehow is also in the air. Now, granted, in the U.S., it goes with the critique of the deep state, and there are other sort of counter currents. But to me, this problem of it's already happening that people are hungry for government that works. Now, here we get to imperialism and so on. I mean, at the same time that government isn't working at the national level, we've got this really frightening struggle over global hegemony going on at the broadest scale. And, we've got basically the U.S. fighting a kind of proxy war, especially ostensibly against Russia, right, over the bodies of Ukrainians, but also hovering in the background, its real object is probably China. So we're facing, in addition to everything else, the prospect of major world war. And there's just a lot of irrationality as well as capitalist rationality, both. So it's an explosive and unpredictable situation. And that's sort of one more reason to get moving and figure out how to intervene in this.
On this basis, I'm going to insert myself back in because this raises a question that we've chatted about individually this week. But Nancy, in reading your book in light of this analysis of the present, it's striking that the capitalism is cannibalistic and violent in a variety of other ways, but that war and militaries actually don't figure particularly prominently in your description of the kind of constituent features of this institutional societal order. And so I wonder sort of where and how you think about the history of war and war making in relation to capital, and I can turn that question to you as well, Jason.
Well, I mean, for me, it belongs in that sort of hidden abode of the political. And that abode has both a sort of global, transnational, international dimension and a dimension at the national level insofar as we still have a international system of multiple territorial states. And at the first level, at the global and international level, the problem, I'm very Origian here. The problem is that somebody in a world economic system that is superimposed on a system of multiple territorial states, an international state system, somebody has got to organize global space, right? And that has fallen to this succession of global hegemons. So there are, I said this at our earlier discussion, you can think about imperialism in more than one way. At one level, we can talk about Landnahme, about land grabbing, resource grabbing, and so on. At another level, it's about competitive struggle among powers. And both of these can lead to wars of different kinds, and sometimes the various kinds of wars are integrated and sort of merged together. So a local resource grabbing war also turns out to be a proxy war, an inter-imperial proxy war. That's what I would say. And it may not be adequately spelled out in my book, but this is very much part of my perspective.
Yeah, or as fundamental to capitalist revolutions were military revolutions. The military revolutions almost always come first, and not just in the early modern era, but in the Industrial Revolution, as Priya Satya has pointed out, and then again in American ascent to global supremacy. So militarized accumulation is the beating heart of the capitalist world ecology. And so you're absolutely right. I love that you pointed this out. There's this Luxembourg-Lenin tension, the inter-imperialist rivalry, and then the move to the frontiers to secure the qualitatively new kinds of cheap nature that are in play. There's also another tension that is essentially irresolvable, which is the Kautsky-Lenin tension, because as even Lenin agreed with Kautsky that the tendency of monopoly capitalism was to lead to ultra-imperialism, but that was not going to occur at that moment, and he was absolutely right, and the consequence was a 30 years war. Why? Precisely because you had these two states, Japan and Germany, boxed out of access to cheap nature because of Anglo-British hegemony, especially. And what we're confronting now, and I totally agree, the war in Ukraine is a war over Belt and Road. It is a new qualitative phase, an epical phase of the war of redivision. Whether it leads to a new 30 years war and what its character is up for grabs. So that sounds very doomist, but let's also remember World War I is brought to an end by proletarian revolt in the German army and in Russia, and that wars and revolutions have a profoundly destabilizing impact on ruling classes. Look at the aftermath 45 to 47 of World War II. So there are moments of opportunity here that are now being reconfigured, rewoven with the climate crisis, not just as weather, but as the what I call the capitalogenic trinity of the climate class divide, climate apartheid, climate patriarchy. That these tensions are now being ramped up in a qualitative and epical way that are leading to militarized strategies of accumulation, that is political accumulation, and move towards a tributary mode.
All right, let's pass it back to the audience.
Is this on? Okay. Yeah, this was fantastic. So, Jason, I just want you to help us to think through one aspect of the contemporary moment. And there is something, I think, novel about this contemporary moment, which is why we are all here, implicitly and talking about this. That I think the imagination of history in nature, or just humans in nature, doesn't think through, and I use this word advisedly, dialectically. In whatever we want to call it, the Capitalocene or the Anthropocene, there is also a scaling up of human agency. Human beings have become not just environmental agents now, but also geological agents. We are no more just a part of nature, but also one of its forces. I think this is a quantitative change, but one that has qualitative implications for human agency. I think it's imperative to take this, novelty in human capability and human agency seriously if we really want to understand the path forward. What do you think we can, or how do you think we can think through this in a way that does not, in a way that takes this seriously, but also does not, does not move to a politics of regression.
Should I collect a few?
Sure.
Sorry, I thought there's a bunch of hands. Yeah? Okay. Let's go back to this side. I'm coming back to that side in a second. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. I have a question for Nancy, and I was wondering if you could speak more about what you think is missing from environmentalism, feminism to rise to the level of counter-hegemony. To use your own word, what is still left for us, given the widespread interest in these movements, to actually recognize each other as allies, to use your own words?
Yeah, great.
Thank you. Let's go to Casey. Could you pass this across, please? Thank you very much. Mary Ann, thank you. Keep going.
Thank you very much for all of this. My question is more for Professor Fraser, but I'm also happy for...
Can you speak louder?
Of course. My question is more for you, but I'm happy also if Professor Moore would have something to say as well. In Cannibal Capitalism, you examine 3 kinds of natures. The first being the category for the non-human world, the second being for capitalism's built environments, and the third being the historical materialist approach in understanding the co-production of categories of nature and society through as mediated by capitalist relations. And if I'm not mistaken, in the book, you also argued that it might be impossible for the historical materialist approach that makes Nature 3 to totally supersede the first understanding of the scientifically understood category of the non-human world. And I was wondering if you could explain more on that, and specifically what you think the strengths and limitations of historical materialist approaches replacing that earlier conception are. And I'd also be happy for Professor Moore to also discuss this as well.
Okay.
Should we do one more? Or is that
Why don't we pause? That's a lot to do.
Yeah, I sort of already forgot the other ones. Let me start with that, since it's very fresh in my mind, which is otherwise I'm losing the thread. I think this might be a point in which we actually have a difference. And I'll just start with by saying that from a conceptual point of view, I'm taking what you could call a Wittgensteinian approach. There are multiple meanings, and the word nature has a role in many different language games, and they can't all be reduced to one concept of nature. I think we need to be able to talk about nature at several different levels. So what you called non-human nature, I wouldn't use that phrase, because humans are part of the nature that science studies, right? Natural science we speak of. And that includes, obviously astrophysics, organic chemistry, climate science. This tells us what happens to molecules when greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. That's not historical materialism, but it's pretty damn important. Historical materialism is, I think, what Jason means by historical natures and by the socio-ecological, which is a word I like a lot and use, which is about, right? He calls it the web of life, in which there's such entanglements that you are never encountering the purely social and the purely natural, but always these things as transformed, interacting in a dialectical way. And we absolutely need that. In addition, there are all sorts of what you could call more philosophical or cosmological, spiritual in some cases, or ideological views about nature, including the one that I would argue is built into the practice of capital accumulation right, as normally, which is the idea of nature as just there, stuff that we can take and do what we want with and don't have to worry about replenishing, the so-called free gift ideology. But then there are all the communalist, philosophies of nature that people all over the world share, many different variants and so on. And at that level, I say, let's absolutely prevent the operationalization of any philosophy of nature that's going to destroy the possibility of having a good life for us and the possibility of ecological reproduction continuing in a good way. Let's absolutely stop them in their tracks. If people want to believe that in private about the free gift, I'm not going to go police their thoughts. But no, you don't get to run the world. But otherwise, let 100 flowers bloom. Let people think about nature however they want. I don't think we need, this is almost a Rawlsian liberal point. Let's just agree that we have to stop cannibalizing it and figure out how to do that. And, I don't have to sign on to Quechuan view of Pachamama or whatever. That's fine. But I think that these things don't add up to one concept. And if you just think about it from the standpoint of inquiry, we need more than one kind of inquiry. We need natural scientific inquiry, we need historical materialist inquiry, and so on and so forth. So that's why, and I don't know, that's why I'm made uncomfortable. I won't rise to the level of saying I disagree with it, but I'm made uncomfortable with your sort of, anti-Cartesianism. I don't know exactly what that means, because I would say that after Descartes, there's not a lot of Cartesianism in the philosophy I study, and which doesn't mean that there's anything that's a lot better. Anyway, so this is something that it would be interesting to have an exchange about. Why don't I stop there and let's have that exchange before I go into the second one?
It was going to happen, and now it is happening.
That's so in a strictly philosophical sense, of course, you're entirely correct. And the main lines of modern philosophy go in a very different direction. As a geocultural formation, Descartes really captures the zeitgeist of capitalism in the age of climate crisis and climate fixing, which is to do what? To reestablish the conditions of production per capital, to resolve the surplus capital problem, to reestablish the conditions of political stability in this era, right? This is the 30 Years' War, this is the English Civil War, this is the Fronde, this is all of this, so that it becomes a geocultural formation that was already in process, whose dominant form is a civilizing project, the civilized and the savage. And that then gets reinvented in successive Malthusian moments, later with Malthus, with eugenics, with the environmentalism of the rich, and Spaceship Earth and Anthropocene environmentalism, and sustainable development. So it's that's, I think, the broader point. I'm not sure if that's so much in conflict as to understand the sort of geocultural DNA of capitalism. Why is that binary so important? Because it is a relation and strategy of domination that allows for super exploitation that is necessary because capitalism is such a damn expensive system to run. That's why it's so important to find the cheap nature. The proletarian form is so expensive, and it provides qualities that cannot be met in other ways. So I think, as you were talking, Nancy, I think really I don't think that we disagree. I think we have different ways of formulating it, but these three natures that you've identified, they're distinctive moments in the totality that I advance. So sometimes you say, well, Moore, I think in New Left Review, you say, well, he's a bit of a constructivist there. But in fact, I begin, a little bit there, the nature three kind of thing. But in fact, I begin Web of Life with Johann Rockström and Planetary Boundaries, which I find a deeply problematic formula, but in that transhistoric sense of science, you're absolutely right. But then there's also the Marx point that to speak of two sciences is an illusion, that we need a proletarian science, a proletarian inner science.
Yeah, that's where I'm not so sure.
Yeah, well, that's
I
a
mean,
point.
I think
That's a good-
science is multiple, and that inquiry is determined. The object of inquiry is determined by, really what you need the knowledge for, and yeah. So, I don't
Well,
know. I
precisely,
don't know
we
about
need it for
overcoming
climate
that.
justice.
Yeah, correct. And we need both to understand the socio-historical drivers of climate injustice, and the natural scientific consequences of that injustice.
But let's go back to
Both.
but this disagreement over Cartesianism is interesting because
Yeah.
it parallels with the discussion of science. That science, as Paracelsus and many others have pointed out, is a fundamental pillar of American Cold War hegemony. It's not innocent, and especially Earth system science is so fundamental to the emergence of, as he puts it, how the UN or American hegemony, in my view, built spaceship Earth. That has to be put into play as well.
Fair enough, but we're also relying, all of us sitting here, on climate science, right?
Which is part of the problem.
No, it's not. It's actually part of the solution.
Not when Johan Rockström goes to the World Economic
That's
Forum
not
and
the
says,
only use of it.
right, but that's a hegemonic one.
Okay,
If
but
we're
that's
gonna
not
do
the fault of the
hegemonic.
science. That's the fault
No,
of the power.
absolutely. Look at how much they violate. Look, it's the Garrett Hardin syndrome. Like, Garrett Hardin, who knew absolutely nothing about commons, is licensed because he's a biologist to publish in the pages of Science in 1968. But the Anthropocene people, I mean, Will Steffen and Paul Crutzen and all these.
No, I'm not talking about Anthropocene, because that gets to one of the other questions. The Anthropocene discourse, the problem is it's actually, because it's actually trying to merge two senses of science in an illegitimate way, two senses of nature in an illegitimate way. It's trying to collapse, right, a sort of natural science set of points with this question of the human, which is a historical question: who lit the fire, so to speak, as Malm posed it. And it's mashing up these two things. These are two different questions, right? How much carbon can the atmosphere of the Earth sequester? And at what point it's too much?
But you understand
that's one question. Another question is, who lit this fire? These are not the same.
But the first question is an old question of carrying capacity. It's not that we can't deal with that,
Yes.
but we have to problematize that in terms of the long history of environmental and other forms of neo-Malthusianism.
Well, I'm not defending Malthusianism, absolutely not. But I am saying that I think the Anthropocene discourse, I think what I'm saying is actually very much a riff on you. What I'm saying is that the critique of the Anthropocene discourse should be precisely that it smashes up together two distinct forms of inquiry about nature.
But they've always been smashed up. Anyway.
No, but we're trying to unsmash them, not re-smash them.
I have what may be another way of posing this, which is, I mean, it seems to be, Nancy, that your critique of the Anthropocene concept, as it is often deployed by people doing hard science, it is one in which we can recognize the social embeddedness, or social situatedness of people who happen to be scientists, in the same way, say, that Marx is able to kind of admire the dialectical qualities of Darwin and recognize that Darwin, married to Wedgwood's daughter, basically sees industrial relations in nature. And so I guess the question is, if we think about people practicing hard science as people that inhabit the same world that we do, then how do we think about sort of when to think of them contextually and the work that they produce contextually, and when to think about it as existing in some sort of objective relation to a nature that is always out there?
Well, that's exactly the point I'm trying to make, that those are two different questions to ask, and when depends on what's happening and what you're trying to do.
Great.
So there was this.
So let's try to. I mean, there were a few more questions in that circle that may actually sort of add texture to this. So maybe do you, Jason, want to respond to Sachayet's question about sort of
Can you just give me the one sentence version of it, because so much has happened since then.
Sure. I was just asking about what is why are environmentalism and feminism failing to rise to the level of counter-hegemony that
why?
you were pointing
Yeah,
to?
yeah.
That's the one.
Got it.
Sentence version.
Yeah, and I'll just give you the one sentence answer. What's required to overcome the dissociation to the extent, I mean, there are plenty of places where, it overlaps, not always in the best possible way in certain ecofeminist discourses, which I don't like, but no, what's needed to overcome the dissociation or to improve the quality of the association is basically a critique of capitalism. Now that you could say that's a cognitive thing, that we need to cognitively understand that there's one social system, one social totality that is driving a whole set of very bad things, and that to fight them, people have to unite in some way. Okay, that's cognitive. I'm sort of reading something into your question. Is the cognitive enough, or is that a kind of thin glue? What about an affective moment? And it's absolutely true. This might be one of the advantages of sort of going back to some expanded idea of an internally differentiated planetary working class. When you have a sort of a name for who you are, that gives it a kind of identitarian, affectively charged thing. It gives a name to the us versus them. Some people would say, oh, the multitude, or whatever, but that's, to me, too weak to do the job, and it's also annoyingly imprecise. So my thought, and this is very much a work in progress, I'm currently writing a book called 3 Faces of Capitalist Labor, uncovering the hidden ties between gender, race, and class. And it's the idea that you don't have capitalism without exploited, expropriated, and I need another EX word that works, because I love these alliterations. But what I'm now at the moment calling domesticated labor, not domestic, domesticated. And that's sort of the Du Bois, I call it Du Bois plus 1, 3 labor movements that don't recognize. Okay, so my idea is maybe some kind of way of reinterpreting the working class, what it is. I think this coheres with what you've been saying. Starts to construct some more a sense of who we are, but with the crucial caveat that we're not all the same, because there are at least 3 faces of labor. And of course, there are all the ways in which they intersect, and we're all doing more than one form of labor, most of us. That might add a little bit of affective heft. I don't know.
No, I totally agree. That was fantastic. The question about, first, about humans and nature, of course, that's only a point of departure. So if you leave it at that, then it's just a slogan, and it doesn't go beyond lots of holism over the decades. But the argument is very different. So the Holocene itself, as Ruddiman has demonstrated, is a product, well, he doesn't call it class society, but I will, of class society. That is, the carbonization that begins with agriculture makes the Holocene, which is an interglacial period, very, very distinctive. And it does not, as Ruddiman shows, revert to an ice age on the model of previous interglacial periods. So that's a riddle. Why is that? What is it that stabilizes atmospheric carbonization at around 270 parts per million until the industrial era? Well, in short, it's class society, it's agriculture, which becomes, even though demographically small, an Archimedean lever for wider networks of pastoralism, and land use change worldwide. So the Holocene itself is a product of class society. That is emphatically not, and I'm not saying you're saying this, a product of humanity doing it. Humanity does nothing. specific groups of human beings, classes, empires, corporations, socialist parties, states do make history. Climate doesn't, this is one of the great mystifications of much environmentalist thought, that climate doesn't have agency. Agency is a historically joined, dialectically joined relation of human and extra-human life and power. And that's very important to keep in mind, so that we see class society becoming a geobiological force from about 8,000 years ago. We have stabilizing, in the very specific sense of stabilizing atmospheric carbonization. We see at several other points, but then the most notable point, of course, is underscored by Mark Maslin and Simon Lewis, the great biogeographers at University College London, on the Orbis spike. That is, the slaving-induced genocides of the New World lead to a dramatic drawdown of carbon dioxide concentration, 6 or 7 points, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in concert with other shifts, volcanic activity, shifts in the North Atlantic oscillation, co-produce this extraordinary long, cold 17th century, at which most of the geocultural moments, as well as the class dynamics and capital formation of early capitalism formed between 1550 and 1700, politically, economically, culturally, the way that domination and exploitation and the web of life fit together, the scientific revolution, all of this comes together in this moment of climate crisis, which is the first capitalogenic crisis. Again, not made by humans, which I think is a form of climate denialism. To say anthropogenic and leave it at that is a form of denialism. You're totally right. We need to name the system, and we need to name the enemies. Those responsible for climate crisis have names and addresses. They have to be held to account. And we need analytics that stop pussyfooting around that issue. And so that would be my response. It's a great question.
Can I add one little point? And this is going to introduce a disagreement, okay? But we should, why waste this time? Let's talk about it. So I want to know, Jason, what you think we get politically by saying nature works. I didn't say there are 4 faces of labor. I said, exploited, expropriated, domesticated. To me, that gives us a working class that's much larger, more accurately internally, but it is a human working class and a potential political agent, a potential collective agent. Now, there are lots of reasons why people think that nature has agency and so on, non-human nature, and that's fine with me. I don't deny any of that. And I can understand why one might want to say it works. Okay, oxen have worked. I don't dispute that. Horses have worked and so on. Do bacteria work? I'm not so sure. Yeah, but the point is, what are we? I worry that this muddies the political waters in terms of constructing an agent of emancipation. And I gather that, because I think that work is already, human work is already, all about transforming nature, as I'm sure you do. But then to say that nature also works. Anyway, that's my question.
You ever spent much time on the farm? I mean,
actually, yes. I even sort of live on one.
We're back to Marx and to Raymond Williams.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
course.
the broader question, and you've been posing this question to me for a while, and I think that I've begun to answer it, is that a conception of biotariat and femitariat without, rather proletariat and femitariat without the biotariat is essentially a recipe for a continued Prometheanism that is a bourgeois ideology, and that fractures the solidarity between humans and the web of life, and reproduces the alienated, violent, dominating relations between humans and the web of life. Now, is there a bad way to do this, a romantic way to do this? Yes. Is there an idealist way to do this? Yes. But is there a concrete, practical need for solidarity with all forms of extrahuman life from a critical proletarian standpoint, I would say emphatically, yes, that much of what the history of concrete economic activities from industrializations, agricultural revolutions, extractive moments is about putting extrahuman life to work. Now, I wouldn't say nature to work anymore because I think that that's a fetish.
Who's putting it to work?
Capital.
Okay.
Capital through the...
It's not putting itself to work.
No, but nothing puts itself... I mean...
Well.
If we're talking about the concrete metabolisms of historical capitalism, so let's look at specific historical turning points. I don't think this is an abstract, we can take it to an abstract level, but that only works if we ground it in the specific historical geographies of, say, let's take something as fundamental as sugar plantations, right? There's a metabolic process that only works and only thrived and only accumulated capital to the degree that soils and forests and streams could be put to work for free or low cost for capital. And that's a fundamental violence between capital and the biotariat, but also inscribed...
Well, presumably socialism is going to put those things to work, but for a different end.
In an emancipated way.
Exactly.
In a cooperative way.
Right.
Yes.
But it's not like, I mean, there is... I mean, really, the point I'm really trying to make is do you define the working class as including non-humans?
Yes, absolutely.
And do you see that, the non-humans, members of the working class, whoever they are, as, the part of the political force that's going to change things?
Part of the
Is it a political agency?
Part of the necessary subjectivity that you've been urging me to think about, precise or the consciousness, whatever we want to call it, the class consciousness, a class consciousness,
our consciousness,
a proletarian consciousness that does not understand the creatures too must go free is a proletarian consciousness
that we agree.
that will reproduce domination, and that until we can see ourselves as comrades in arms with the web of life, any form of planetary socialism will be incomplete. That's an ongoing class struggle.
I think we agree on that point. I'm just pushing on,
and I'm only
on this word work. This word work.
It's so fundamental.
Such a politically potent word.
But do you talk? I mean, like when I talk with peasants, even gardeners, but peasants, farmers who are talking about what happens on the farm, they are talking about many different forms of work that come together, and that's how work works. It is a dialectic of socio-ecological processes. This is Marx and Engels, right? On the one hand, social, on the other hand, natural.
We don't disagree about that. Okay. Sorry, I'll stop.
No, that's so fun.
So why don't we? I think we have looks like 3 or 4 more questions. So why don't we pass the mic, sort of zigzagging back?
Hi. Yeah. Thank you both for all of your questions. I'm really fascinated, and I want to sort of build on this sort of tension about the biotariat and the work that non-human natures do. And I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of the specter of kind of green imperialism, as you were talking about. And I think the reality is for a lot of non-human natures and human natures, humans, I guess, in the global south, part of the problem is that they're unemployed, right? And part of the problem is that they've never had access to the kind of exploitative relations that undergird a kind of citizenship and membership in global capitalism. So I think maybe what would a solidarity look like between unused sections of forest in Latin America that are basically turned into financial assets for offsetting, and people who are sitting on the roadside in somewhere in Africa doing nothing. Because for them it's they're looking to be used. They see capitalism as a way to actually employ their faculties that have just been sort of left to, wait for capitalism to expand their frontiers, right? So, I think they don't necessarily appeal. Or the idea of a kind of planetary crisis doesn't necessarily appeal to them in the same ways, because for them it's not a crisis of labor, it's a crisis of underutilization, or a crisis of waste, right? They're just wasting away. So yeah, I guess I was wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Good.
Let's, in the interests of not engaging in collective super exploitation, let's collect the remaining questions, and then the two of you can sort of decide how to.
Just remind me, waste. I gotta keep all these in mind. Yeah.
Thank you. and sorry if this is too androcentric, but thinking about, this moment of opportunity and the tensions ramping up, this idea of almost like the pressure cooker and this inclusion of nature or the earth, into the working class, I also worry, aren't we, collapsing some hierarchy that for me is important? Because this idea, like the optimism of the moment after, is, I think, dangerously ignoring who are the ones that are going to pay for the crisis, and even if in the moment after there was some kind of, new proletarian moment, like the lives and, are going to be paid are not those of us, sitting at a cushy university in Chicago or, so I worry that maybe this like over theoretical exercise is kind of like underestimating the real cost. That's what's really at stake.
Good.
Hi. I wanted to ask a geopolitical question, and that's related to China. So, with the war over Ukraine and NATO expanding all over Europe, now the new front is East Asia. 3 days ago, 3 new military bases in Philippines were acquired. So one is the military dimension going forward. And the second is the importance of China, at least it may look like a conservative question, but it's an important practical question, is the importance of China in terms of renewable technology, solar power, and so on, and its potential to share some of these technology with countries like India, even if the global north wants to doom itself. Officially, India became the most populous, I don't want to sound like a Malthusian, but with so much underdevelopment, there would be much more demand for energy consumption. And if we are not talking about the practical question about renewable technology, then I think we are missing something. I would like to hear more about how you think about China and its role.
This breaks the flow a little bit. I think part of the problem, part of the tension between your two is actually the conventional discourse on environmentalism. Because I don't believe Malthus was actually about nature at all. He was about poverty,
Population.
right? I don't think Thoreau was about nature at all. He was about escaping fucking Boston, right? If you look at Pinchot, I'm not sure he was about nature. He was about resources. Mm-hmm. If you look at Carson, yeah, a little bit of nature, rocks and trees and birds and things. Environmentalism has sold itself, right? So I was born in '61. Environmentalism kicks in the early '70s, and it develops this own narrative of its own history, right? Liberal feminism does exactly the same thing, right? Liberal feminism erases the anti-racism of 18th century feminism, right? It erases the struggle over the production of space. It erases so much of the richness of labor movements, which were about community, which were about food, which were about mutual aid. They were so much more than Matt Huber's point of production. Matt drives me nuts. Right? So it seems to me that when we go to the movements, what we see is struggle about over all of that. The movements themselves, unless they have to address the state, which insists they simplify, right? The movements themselves are always about all of this. And that's where I think we can remind people, look, this is what you care about. The climate justice struggle is not about nature, right? It's about right livelihood. It's about justice. It's about sustainability. It's about community. It's about ethics of care. It's about all of that together. It's about women's labor, right? And I think the narrative of environmentalism gets us in big trouble because we keep on talking about nature, and we have to stop. The narrative of liberal feminism gets us in trouble because we keep on talking about women instead of gender, right? Instead of the power and naturalization of that stuff, and this way you can get to TERFs, right? Very, very quickly. Our problem is the naturalization of these struggles, the simplification of them. And I think a lot of the tension in the room has been fighting these discourses which insist on reductionist accounts of what people actually struggle over. And when you're involved in a struggle, you always know, oh wait, this isn't just about rocks and trees and birds and things, right? And I happen to love rocks and trees and birds and things.
Good.
Julie, did you want to make one?
Yeah, just very quickly. I was intrigued by this conversation about work and whose work counts. It goes back to sort of your very interesting point about unemployment, and it signaled to me something that you both share and that I want to ask you about, which is you both seem to be sneaking in a very traditional Marxist valorization of work/labor as the basis for some kind of agency, as the basis for some kind of politics. And to me, that sounds very traditional Marxist in a bad way. And I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about that, and you can reject my claim, but that's what I'm reading and what you both share, which is, who works and what works, and that's what's important in deciding some kind of subjectivity or agency.
Very good question. Great. Okay.
Yeah, where should we start? Let's bring it home.
On the table. I'll say a few things about some of it. Let me put the question about waste and sitting by the side of the road and the forest, the offsets, and together with this. So, part of the problem is, in every case, and in a way this goes back to your point too, in every case we're dealing with language that has, all of these sedimented accretions, and the terms are very complicated, and some things are erased and other things are brought out. And so, for me, the term work, it's a very old word with, all these connotations of toil and dishonor and so on in the ancient world, and then it becomes very valorized, the Protestant ethic and, capitalism, blah, blah, blah. But in all these points, what is behind it for me is something called life-making activity, species being, whatever, and then there's the question of what happens to that, and what forms of life-making activity are valorized, or recognized, or remunerated, and so on. So I would say the people sitting by the road are not inactive. They have to scramble harder than pretty much anybody to get some food, to have a place to lie down and rest, and so on and so forth. So there's a phrase I can't sort of remember, but sort of the work of making a living when you don't have a job. That this is highly active life activity, but it doesn't count as working. In the same way that historically a lot of social reproductive activity has not counted as working. The interesting thing is that with unfree expropriated labor, that we don't want to look at it, so it's sort of brushed off the radar screen, but everybody knows that those people are working. It's just that it's a very degraded kind of toil, disrespected, as I say, I call it sub-work. It's not non-work, it's sub-work. That's an interesting distinction, all within this ideological field about what is work and what isn't. So it's true that to go to talk about an expanded working class, labor, all these different faces of labor and so on, it's true that this, I wouldn't say, I would use the word resonates. This resonates with the history of socialism, with the history of, trade unionism and anti-slavery and so on and so forth. But that's good. I think we want to sort of claim our historical resonance there and say, but we want to valorize more forms of life activity and recognize more forms of life activity. Should we say that we're for the movement of expanded life activity? It doesn't quite have the punch. of the expanded working class. But that's the agenda behind it, I think. Let me stop there because I've
I think
already
it's just
forgotten the
so
other
brilliantly
questions.
stated that, I mean, we can just expand it. Life activity determines consciousness, not the other way around. But of course, the other way around happens all the time because that's a question of hegemony and ideology. So I think, first of all, Julian, can you tell, like John Bellamy Foster and the other Orthodox, Matt Huber and company, what you just said? That would be great. Because I think for them, people like Nancy and I are just have committed the crime of apostasy and are just sort of so thoroughly abandoned Marxism because we've abandoned that old formalism.
I'm a Marxist.
Yeah, well, I know. It's what sectarian Marxists love to do, is to denounce other Marxists as not really Marxist, and then, hilarity ensues, unfortunately. But here's, I think, if I can just an enthusiastic second to everything that Nancy just laid out, and to say that, I mean, one of the formulations, or let me just give you two back-of-the-envelope formulations. One is that the value form, the commodity, and the value relations are non-identical. And the expanded reproduction of capital sets in motion and also requires as a precondition socially necessary unpaid work. So for every proletarian moment, there's a biotarian and femitarian moment, which shouldn't be taken taxonomically, that human beings are biotarians too. But this is a way, this is a geopoetics too. I think sometimes, like when Nancy brings up, I think you're totally right to bring up this question of who works and how is it valued. Some of these formulations at this stage of reimagining the paradigm, which is what we're doing, go under the sign of what I call geopoetics, or earth poetry. And geopoetics at their best destabilize received conventional notions of nature or work or gender or whatever it is in very, very generative ways. And that's what we need at the moment of climate crisis. So I would see this, I'm not sure who you're thinking of as in terms of traditional, but if I communicated myself in that way, I've done a poor job. Because I think that what we're looking at here is what are those constitutive dialectical moments of these differentiated unities. You didn't quite get there, but you were saying that. The unity and difference, difference and unity is what we're always looking for.
Okay, good.
All right, I think we should probably leave it there. So can you please join me in thanking
Thank
Jason
you,
Moore and
everyone.
Nancy Fraser again, and thank you all for amazing questions.